doesn't need any introduction, everybody knows him. We see him on the television all the time, especially in the Bell helicopter field. And our second speaker is Mr. Henson. He's the sales manager of Central America and the Caribbean, and he's from Benzoil, Houston. So I think what we do is each speaker takes about 25 minutes, and after that we can open this floor for your questions. And I think it's enough. So let's start with Mr. Bourn.
Yeah, you can turn that off. Okay. It's not going to work all the time. My approach may wind up to be a little different for those of you who may have looked at it. I tell stories, and we're going to give a little historical perspective to this. One of the best-known strategic alliances in history is that formed between Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey in the last century before the Christian era. Gaius Julius Caesar had the bloodline back to the earliest days of Rome, back through both his paternal and maternal bloodlines. And he was the nephew of Gaius Marius, the only man in Roman history to be elected consul 7 times, and perhaps the most talented military genius ever to lead a Roman army. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome. He liked to play in politics, but liked business and money too much to achieve his political ambitions. Senators and all Romans of political office generally were not engaged in commerce directly. That was considered crass and often effectively barred them from holding office. So Crassus mostly played at politics through others. He considered Caesar to be the most talented politician in general of his time, and he also recognized in Caesar the capacity for greatness and an equal capacity for loyalty to his friends and supporters. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus was also very wealthy and an outstanding military general who craved great power and recognition. It's hard to tell, looking at his history, which one he craved the most. But he was not of Rome. Without alliance with Caesar and Crassus, he could not fulfill his dreams of power and glory. He was a Roman citizen from a Latin colony, and as such had difficulty ascending to the highest levels of power in Rome. His family was very wealthy and controlled a great area in southern Umbria and northern Picenum, which is an area to the far northwest of Rome. The people in that area held to Pompeius in great esteem and literally followed his father before him and Pompey to the ends of the earth. Crassus despised Pompey, and Pompey envied Caesar. Caesar was the glue that brought them all together, and he did so purely for his own advantage. He persuaded Crassus to tolerate Pompey and artfully maneuvered his daughter and Pompey into a love match and marriage. In the end, in truth, it was Julia, Caesar's daughter, who bound them together as secret allies. She was loved, even adored, by both Pompey and Caesar, and she was admired by Crassus, at least to the degree that Crassus admired anyone. When Julia died, the uneasy alliance that virtually controlled Rome came unraveled. But that alliance had done its work. Crassus became even richer and more powerful. Pompey and Caesar were propelled to the very pinnacle of power and to a confrontation of epic proportions. Caesar prevailed over Pompey and ultimately was murdered in the Senate by a group of disaffected conspirators, among whom was Brutus, Marcus Junius Brutus. You all remember the famous line from Shakespeare's play, Et tu, Brute, and you, Brutus. Brutus was the son of the famous and wealthy noblewoman, Servilia, with whom Caesar had a torrid love affair lasting many years. Brutus also was Julia's first love and probably the only real love Brutus ever knew. They had pledged themselves to one another when they were teenagers. When Caesar brought Pompey and Julia together, and the sparks ignited, as he knew they would, Caesar earned Brutus's undying hatred. Brutus's uncle, Cato, Marcus Porcius Cato, also was a longtime political foe of Caesar, Crassus, and Pompey, and had great influence over Brutus from the time he was a teenager. Brutus, Cato, and others formed an alliance to counter Caesar's alliance. That it was not effective enough to counter Caesar's alliance, and later Caesar operating outside that alliance brought about Caesar's murder. Now this story, which is completely true, as nearly as anyone can determine, contains great lessons about strategic alliances of all kinds. Strategic alliances are very difficult to form, and they require very strong commitments among and between the allies. They require great effort to maintain and must provide benefits to all allies that could not be obtained, at least to as great a degree, in any other way. They are not just marriages of convenience. And there's always something very strong that holds them together in difficult times. That something often is not well recognized or fully appreciated until it is weakened or absent. When that happens, there is a point of great crisis that may bring about the dissolution of the strategic alliance. That is as true today of all nature of strategic alliances as it was in the period of the late Roman Republic, more than 2,000 years ago. Strong and effective strategic alliances also precipitate the formation of opposing strategic alliances that can endanger them and sometimes completely wreck them, such as the alliance that was put together by Cato. The other force that pulls centrifugal in strategic alliances is the desire of others to engage in a strategic alliance with one or more of the allies. That is what happened to Pompey. His ego was so huge and his lust for power and recognition so consuming that it made him susceptible to a group of senators and other powerful Romans opposed to Caesar, who saw Pompey as less threatening and more controllable than Caesar. At the time of Julius Caesar, I doubt the term existed. Strategic alliance is a more modern term and comes from the lexicon of diplomatic relations. In such instances, the alliances are between nations and are formalized in treaties. They are formed to gain an edge in trade, colonization, or war, and sometimes all three. These kinds of strategic alliances are represented by NATO and NATO. Another one that we often would not think of as a strategic alliance, but is very much so, is the United Nations. They all have the common goal of accomplishing something that either can be better accomplished through an alliance than through uncoordinated individual efforts, or accomplishing something that can only be accomplished through a bilateral or multilateral alliance, such as world peace. Looking at many of the strategic alliances of a diplomatic nature in recent times, we might conclude that they do not function very well. These alliances often fall short in accomplishing their primary goal, such as the goal of world peace, which is the primary goal of the United Nations. However, the standard, rather than perfection, might better be whether the outcomes from such alliances have been more positive than the outcome that might have resulted had there been no such alliances. Another important consideration is whether such alliances are learning and improving, and whether their level of performance in attaining their goals is constantly improving. For example, when the United Nations was formed after World War II, the real issue was to prevent another global conflict, and indeed that has been accomplished. As the United Nations has gone on in time, we've had greater expectations of that alliance, and we think it ought to prevent all wars. And frankly, that has turned out to be impossible. The first time that I remember seeing the term applied to business was in the Harvard Business Review several years ago. The article that I read dealt with technology, marketing, and production alliances between companies, often companies based in different nations who historically have been competitors. The kind of alliances that Dr. Anwar and Mike were really speaking about for the most part during the first segment. The strategic alliances in this instance were all limited in scope and in all respects but those covered by the alliance agreement, the companies remained competitors. In other words, the alliances were not for the purpose of forming cartels, but for the purpose of pursuing specific advantages in a manufacturing capability, technology development, or marketing. It sounds a whole lot like treaties between companies rather than nations. Probably one of the most interesting that everyone forgets about is the Microsoft and IBM strategic alliance that was critical to the introduction of the IBM personal computer in 1981. IBM kind of had everything put together, and they had no operating system. And they went to Microsoft, and frankly, Microsoft couldn't develop an operating system quickly enough. Microsoft bought an operating system from someone else and modified it to create what was known then as PC-DOS. And they intelligently did not turn over all the rights to IBM for that operating system, something that IBM was insisting upon, and Microsoft was able to resist because without them, IBM had no operating system, it had no product. So it's kind of an interesting history. We all know about Microsoft and Intel, what everybody calls Wintel now, that seems to dominate the computer business. The counter-alliance that was formed that involved IBM, Motorola, Compaq, Apple, and I believe there may be another one or two involved in that, was to develop the PowerPC chip. And in fact, the new Apple systems that are being touted and on the market use the PowerPC chip as the microprocessor. Dow Corning is another one. One of the things you notice always when you look at technology-based companies is that technology seems to foster strategic alliances. Strategic alliances in business today are advancing far beyond those that once and still are being formed for these purposes. This, to me, is the brave new world of strategic alliances that is the outgrowth of the trends toward defining and concentrating on core competencies. Everybody's familiar with that great buzzword, and outsourcing other kinds of business activities. This is the brave new world of strategic alliances that I think has much more capacity to change the way business is conducted than the initial and still very vital form of technology, marketing, and production strategic alliances. This newer form of strategic alliance is a direct descendant of the concept of supplier partners. That concept developed as companies began looking at outsourcing non-critical kinds of functions and even outsourcing critical kinds of functions like human resources that were not part of the core competencies of the corporation. As they engaged in this outsourcing, they did it through the ordinary vendor relationship, and that did not produce the desired results. And so they looked at tighter partnerships with companies. They also found something very interesting, and that was that there was not necessarily a relationship between cost and the value of what they received. That often the services that they received were of the greatest value were supplied by people who also turned out to be the lowest cost suppliers. And so something was wrong with that picture and the way things worked primarily. The supplier strategic alliance between companies generally is different than the strategic alliance between nations. And it also is less enduring. Supplier strategic alliances generally are bilateral, but a company may form several supplier strategic alliances, each with a different purpose or in a different geographic location. Intel and Microsoft, for example, each have literally hundreds of strategic alliances. And it makes them very different kinds of companies. And one of the reading selections that I recommended to you, The Age of Unreason, talks about Shamrock Corporation as part of that. And that is kind of the model that exists for Intel and for people like Microsoft. Supplier strategic alliances usually proceed through a progression. People are first vendors, then they are preferred suppliers, then they are supplier partners, and then they become strategic alliances. And let me also comment that we're going to talk about a little bit about the characteristics of each of these. But these are really not discrete stages except for the first and the last. It's a continuum, and it's a continuum in supplier partnerships that a progression occurs through rather than just immediately the strategic alliance being formed. In the vendor situation, you have closed book. There is really no information being shared between the companies. There's little differentiation in the product or service being provided. The most likely comparative example is just something that is a commodity, although in this instance it need not necessarily be a commodity. You have a minimum contract life for the period of supply, usually not longer than a year. The whole thing is contract driven with very specific price, delivery, and performance terms, and it focuses exclusively on the lowest price. At the next level, the preferred supplier relationship, it's a longer term relationship. Trust has been earned by the supplier. There is some differentiation in the product or service. Quality programs generally have been implemented and are required by the customer to the supplier, but they need not necessarily be the customer's quality programs, just that there is some kind of quality program in place. Price and quality get considered, and it begins to focus more on total value than simply price. Now the next two, the supplier partner situation and the strategic alliance, the dividing line between them is very fine. And if you talk to people who are very familiar with strategic alliances, you could get into all kinds of interesting debates about which ones of these things belong in which category. But they are long-term relationships. They're open book. Typically, the supplier's books are completely open to the customer. There's a high level of trust. There's a win-win approach to everything. Top management interchange also occurs between the companies. There is a continuous exchange of ideas. There's even business process re-engineering, both on the supplier side and the customer side, to make this strategic alliance operate more effectively. And there's a focus on significant value added. The strategic alliance situation, and I'm getting funny colors here that are different than the colors I have in there, they really get to the point where you have a mutual dependency. It would be very difficult to take apart that strategic alliance. It would harm both the supplier and the customer to do that. You have a completely open book relationship where not only are the supplier's books open to the customer, but the customer's books are open to the supplier. There's a strategic framework in place, a long-range plan for increasing the effectiveness and the value of the strategic alliance relationship. There's a very high level of commitment. There are increased capabilities and capacities both for the supplier and the customer as a result of the relationship. There are enhanced business opportunities, particularly for the supplier, because of the tightness of this relationship with the customer. And there is improving share owner value on the part of both of the parties. And they still are based upon contracts for OEM products and for services in relationships where one party is clearly the supplier and the other is clearly the customer. Generally, but not always, the supplier is considerably smaller than the customer company. The areas of human resources services and computer hardware and software are notable exceptions. And if you just think about the relationships that exist between Intel and Microsoft and many of the people who are their customers with whom they have strategic product development relationships, Intel and Microsoft are both oftentimes much larger than those customers. It's also true, we've gotten into this area of human resources services and being provided to companies. And the companies that do that often are legally the employers of the people who work for the other companies. So we have many situations like that in Amarillo. The human resources services supplier in those circumstances is also often much larger than the customer companies that they serve. This brave new world of strategic alliances focusing on supplier relationships offers incredible growth opportunities for suppliers and at the same time poses the greatest threat to the continued existence of a great many suppliers, both services and OEM products. It is not a question of whether to get involved in this game or not. It is a question only of how to go about it and doing so as quickly as possible. Not getting involved in this game will doom many suppliers to extinction in the next 2 decades. It already has doomed many to extinction. The problem and the opportunity for many suppliers is that many multinational companies are rapidly reducing the number of supplier relationships that they manage. And actually, it isn't just multinational companies. I know companies like Mike's company, multi-location healthcare providers, and others. They've managed a lot of supplier relationships. It's much more effective and more efficient for them to manage many fewer relationships that where there's a strategic partnership, and that means somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. Ford announced earlier this decade that it would reduce its suppliers worldwide from 50,000 to 5,000 within 10 years. Now, whether that goal will be achieved in 10 years or not, and whether the actual reduction to 5,000 isn't important. What's important is that at the end of some period of time, Ford will have a whole lot fewer suppliers than it had at the beginning of that process. Some of those suppliers will have been there in the beginning, and they will be much larger companies than they were. Other suppliers will not be there as Ford progresses down this path, and many of them will be completely out of business as a result of not adapting to this new kind of relationship. Now, these supplier strategic alliances have some interesting characteristics. They usually are based on TQM principles, and they require suppliers to adopt a specific quality program. So if you're a supplier to several different multinational companies, you will have several different quality programs, each related to each one of those customers. That just fits neatly hand in glove into their existing quality program. That may sound like a difficult thing to accomplish, but it's actually not proven to be a difficult thing to accomplish. As we said before, the alliance involves an open books relationship. There is a standing committee or team with members from both the supplier and the customer, and sometimes even the customer's customers, that reviews performance of both parties and the alliance itself on a regular basis. And oftentimes there are several such teams operating at different levels. These teams are also charged with resolving problems, and by that I don't mean problems that exist between the companies, but problems that may exist for the customer company that together a strategic alliance partner and the customer company, or many strategic alliance partners and the customer company, may seek to resolve. It's just like a TQM problem-solving team within a company, but now it involves people who are outside the company. Supplier alliances are built on the principles of continuous improvement, that nice old TQM cornerstone, cost reduction, and value enhancement. And obviously, value enhancement and cost reduction kind of play off against one another. Supplier alliances do develop gradually, and they go through that vendor to strategic alliance continuum. What is interesting, though, is today where there are large customer companies that are set up to go to strategic alliance relationships with suppliers, that you can go all the way from being a vendor to being a strategic ally in 3 years' time. Whereas in the past, that kind of progression took 10 or 12 years, or sometimes even longer than that. One of the really interesting things is that supplier alliances require a new approach toward contract negotiation, one that views the relationship with the customer as an enduring one, and problems of the customer as their problems also. The negotiation aspect of these supplier strategic alliances is one of their most interesting aspects. And in these respects, the alliances are like diplomatic alliances. The parties seek to maintain the integrity of the alliance above all else, or almost all else. And that's because of this mutual dependency that develops. The last thing generally that you want to happen with a strategic alliance is that it come apart. So naturally, the most important thing becomes keeping that alliance together. The contractual agreement then between the parties winds up focusing on a means by which the parties can reach agreement on unforeseen issues that may arise in the future. And it winds up focusing on responsibilities of the parties and obligations to each other, as well as the underlying principles of the agreement, instead of specific terms for purchase and delivery. This approach to negotiation and problem solving is one that has both parties on the same side of the table with a problem out there in front of them, instead of on opposite sides of the table, each trying to figure out how they can take advantage of the other, which is the traditional negotiation that is almost a zero-sum kind of a negotiation. This is allergy season and my voice begins to go. This concept is not just the latest management fad. It hasn't been visible to very many people, I don't think, unless you're in a company where there is a supplier strategic partnership. Because many of the suppliers, even those that are multi-billion-dollar corporations, unless you work for one of them or unless you do business with one of them, they're transparent. No one knows who they are. There are corporations out there that do nothing but provide facilities, maintenance, and janitorial services. And they enter into contracts with large corporations where they manage millions of square feet for those corporations in strategic alliances. They're well over billion-dollar corporations, and none of us would recognize any of their names because they're hidden to everyone but their customers and their employees, of course. One of the other things that's really interesting, I think, about strategic alliances is that no strategic alliance will last forever. I think a lot of people think that they can engage in a strategic alliance and that strategic alliance will just always be there as long as they work hard to maintain that alliance. But things change and that's not possible. And I'm sure E.T. later is going to talk about this in some detail. That means that you've got to contemplate the end of the alliance at the outset, and you've got to revisit what the exit strategy is for the allies several times, and through the relationship, even when there's nothing wrong, to indicate that it might end. And here's just a nice little Far Side cartoon that I think kind of illustrates this. There's obviously been a strategic alliance that's existed between these birds and this fellow walking through the jungle. But it's very clear that it's going to have to end pretty soon, and those birds are going to have to find somewhere else to be, someone else with whom to have a strategic alliance. A strategic alliance, I think, also depends ultimately on the people involved in the interface between the parties. If they don't get along and they don't trust one another at all levels, the alliance is fatally flawed. And there is no way of getting around that. And even simple things like the difference between corporate cultures, even simple things like the way people behave toward one another, has an effect on that. Here's another Far Side cartoon. I'll read this for you. It's one of the nicest evenings I've ever spent at the Wilsons, and then you had to go do that on the road. That obviously destroyed that friendship of many years, and strategic alliances can end on very simple differences between the way executives in corporations deal with one another and conduct themselves. Think about strategic alliances that would get formed by a Silicon Valley company and a Boston-based corporation. Could be very different cultures. And in fact, sometimes situations where you would think the companies have a common culture, they don't at all. You all may remember when Novell purchased WordPerfect several years ago, and what happened to that. I mean, WordPerfect lost market share just almost uncontrollably. And finally, Novell sold WordPerfect to Corel for, I don't know, about a fourth of what they paid for it. And WordPerfect is on its way back, but it simply can't regain the market share that it lost. Microsoft has gotten out there and gotten word on everybody's machines, and now they can't get it back, except for those people who hung with them. Novell was a very formal kind of an environment, and WordPerfect was more like a Silicon Valley kind of environment. When Novell took over, they started trying to impose their culture on WordPerfect. People at WordPerfect said, hey, we don't have to put up with this. We got rich on this purchase. We're going to go form our own companies. And these companies existed within 15 miles of one another, drew from the same labor force along the Wasatch Front in Utah. Yet the corporate cultures were like night and day, and they didn't understand the importance of those corporate cultures. The other interesting thing is that we also need to keep in mind that there isn't anything we can do in business that will provide a permanent strategic advantage. In fact, it seems that we can't find a way to fashion any strategic advantage that lasts very long. And I've kind of paraphrased Bob Ravini, but he says that there is no such thing as a sustainable competitive advantage. As soon as one competitor gains competitive advantage, another competitor will counter that advantage with one of his own. Strategic alliances do seek to form tight relationships that provide continuous improvements, there's that word again, which result in a constant stream of competitive advantages. It helps a company stay one step ahead of the competition, but the pace is quickening. I don't know how many of you are runners. Or if you can imagine being in that situation, but that's kind of like what the competitive environment is in the world today. Let me close with a statement from the Age of Unreason. Charles Handy is one of my favorite business and social philosophers. And he says, we are now entering an age of unreason, when the future is there to be shaped by us and for us, a time when the only prediction that will hold true is that no predictions will hold true. A time, therefore, for bold imaginings, thinking the unlikely and doing the unreasonable. He likes the word unreasonable, and in that book, if you've read it or you happen to read it, he talks about the need for not innovative people, but unreasonable people to change the way many corporations do business. One final comment, going back to the example that I used in the beginning, that of the triumvirate between Caesar and Crassus and Pompey, and the fact that Julia was what really held that together. All strategic alliances had a Julia. Often, though, that's not well recognized. Everyone's concentrating on the reasons that the alliance exists and the benefits to be gained from the alliance, and no one really often concentrates on what holds that alliance together until often it's too late. The alliance is ready to come apart. It's sometimes people, it's sometimes a single person, it's sometimes very strongly shared values or principles, but it's always there, and I would submit it's almost always unrecognized, and if it is recognized, it's always either not appreciated at all or underappreciated. And I think that's why so few strategic alliances really last for a very long period of time, because everybody forgets about where the glue is and what holds them together. Thank you.